It's March in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to take you on a walking tour among the world-famous cherry blossoms. So let me jump around to the other side of the camera, and then we'll get started. It's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C. The sun is mostly out, the blossoms are mostly blooming, and I'm going to take you around and show you what it looks like during peak bloom. Well, technically, it's not peak bloom yet. The day I'm recording this, National Park Service has not yet declared that the blossoms are in peak bloom, but we have to be getting really close. You'll see as I go around. A lot of the trees are definitely in bloom or extremely close. So by the time you're watching this, I'm sure the National Park Service will have declared peak bloom. But for now, this is what they look like. By the way, if you're new around here, my name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. In addition to regular walking tours, I've been doing these virtual cherry blossom walking tours here on YouTube for the past 3 years. So this is my third one. And if you really dig the blossoms, you really dig these virtual walking tours, I will leave a link to a playlist in the description where you can watch my previous walks from 2021 and 2022. I actually started doing this back in 2021 because, if you recall, not a lot of people were traveling that year. That was definitely a bit of a slow travel year, still coming out of COVID, and so I recorded my first virtual walk as a way for people to see the beauty of the blossoms, even if they weren't able to take a spring break trip. That said, as you'll notice, there are a lot of people out here today. Spring break is back in full force. And this is always a very busy time of year here in Washington, D.C. because of the combination of spring break and cherry blossom bloom. So when people ask me when it's the most and least crowded in Washington, D.C., the answer always is, it depends on when kids are off of school, or rather, when kids are on school break. So spring break and summer break are the two busiest times of year, whereas times of year like January and February, when most kids are in school, are much slower and much more chill. Let me tell you about the day that I'm out here today. It's Wednesday, March 22nd. It is late in the afternoon, late day. And like I said, National Park Service has not yet declared peak bloom, but I am sure that they will very, very soon. And by the time you watch this video, they almost definitely have. The temperatures today, mid-60s with light winds, and I have to say, this March has not been particularly nice here in Washington, D.C., so this is probably the nicest day of March so far. Now, this is a restroom right up here. It is helpful when you come see the cherry blossoms to use the restroom before you go. Just a little practical tip for you there. There's not a line for that restroom right now. I guarantee you this weekend, especially if the weather is nice this weekend, there will be lines. There are also portable toilets that they set up for big events like this. I know not everyone loves to use those, but they are an option. But as a tip, go when you can, especially if you're coming from your hotel, because once you get out here, it's a little bit trickier. So I decided this year to walk around the Washington Monument grounds a little bit. This is, by my definition, not the Tidal Basin. To me, the Tidal Basin is the area south of Independence Avenue, which I will be crossing in a little while. And so to me, this area is what I would consider to be the Washington Monument grounds. And I wanted to come over here because in my previous 2 live walks, I did not explore this area. And I feel like there is a big, dense concentration of cherry trees over here that are beautiful. They're great. And if you come over here, and you want to take your portraits or your selfies or just have something interesting in the background, you can get the Washington Monument in the background, and that is pretty cool in my book. Now, the thing about the Washington Monument grounds is that, unlike the Tidal Basin, the cherry trees are kind of in little patches. So I'm walking through right now a little patch of cherry trees here, and then once I come out, you'll see a big empty field. This is where they play kickball in the summer and softball and other intramural sports. But like right over here, this is another example of one of those cherry blossom patches. So it's a little bit different experience coming here than going to the Tidal Basin. But if you have the opportunity, why not both? And of course, like I said, you get the Washington Monument in view with its two very distinct colors. The Washington Monument is actually made out of 3 colors of stone. And if you're curious about what the third color is, I made an entire video on this topic that I will link to in the description if you are curious and want to check it out. So this year, we are going to have another early peak bloom. So let's talk about that. Every year on March 1st, National Park Service makes a prediction for peak bloom. This year's prediction is March 22nd, today, through March 25th, which means that they think on any one of these days, today, tomorrow, or the 2 days afterwards, that we will declare peak bloom. And it looks like they're probably going to nail it this year. It looks like if they don't declare it today, if they declare it tomorrow, then they will have gotten it almost exactly right. That said, I did post a short video about how in the small print on the official nps.gov National Park Service website, it says that it is nearly impossible to predict peak bloom more than 10 days out. So even though it seems like they're going to get it this year, they've definitely had some misses in the past, including 2021, the first year that I made one of these, and they missed it by 5 days. So their prediction, their initial March 1st prediction, was for April 2nd to the 5th. And then the actual peak bloom was on March 28th. And this is exactly the reason why I never advise anyone to plan their trip around peak bloom. Now, speaking of bloom, the Washington Monument and Washington, D.C. in general has lots of trees and lots of flowers other than cherry trees. And that was an example of one that I just walked through right there. So this is the 4th year in a row that we are experiencing a March bloom. And it's the 3rd out of the last 4 years that we got a very early bloom. So people always ask me, and they ask anyone who works in Washington, D.C. tourism, when is the bloom? And I wish that it was as simple as saying the bloom will be on this date, show up on this date, and you will get to see it. But the reality is that it is dependent on a lot of very unstable weather factors, particularly the weather in the days, weeks, and months leading up to March. So the range for when we could experience peak bloom is huge. It's weeks long. The earliest peak blooms have been before spring has even officially started in mid-March, and the latest peak blooms have been nearly a month later in mid-April. So it's nearly impossible to give guidance on this question other than to say, come when you can come, whenever you can plan your trip, whenever you can find a deal that you're happy with, a hotel rate that you're happy with, come take your trip. And if you get lucky and you're here during peak bloom, awesome. And if you miss them, that's okay too, because there is always something in bloom. And here's an example right here of these trees, to my eye, look like they are not in full bloom yet. So when you come, there's always going to be some trees that are going to be earlier bloomers, some trees that are going to be later bloomers. And if you're too early for peak bloom around the Tidal Basin, you might be able to see the magnolias in bloom, for example. Those started blooming this year about 3 weeks ago. So there are magnolia trees at the Smithsonian Castle. There's some over near the Jefferson Memorial and George Mason Memorial, and there's some at the FDR Memorial, among many other places. So you can always catch something in bloom, or if you come late, the Kwanzan cherry trees, the very, very bright pink ones, those are often later bloomers. So you can see those even if you miss the white Yoshinos that are mostly around the Tidal Basin. There's always going to be something. I am thrilled that the World War II Memorial, which is straight up here, has the water turned back on. I've been giving tours this March, and it's always a bummer, this period of the year when winter is ending and spring is starting, and National Park Service sometimes takes their time, let's just say, to turn the water on in the memorials. And last year, 2022, the water at the World War II Memorial didn't return until April, and that really bummed me out because that monument is much better with the water on. And if you're curious to see what it looks like at night, I recorded a similar one of these virtual walking tours. It's a midnight tour of the monuments. I saw the three that I think you should see after dark: Washington Monument, World War II Memorial, and Lincoln Memorial. And so I will leave a link to that in the description. If you want to take a midnight walk with me, if you like this video, then you will probably like the midnight walk as well. So this is Independence Avenue coming up ahead. And like I said, my definition of the Tidal Basin is the south side of Independence Avenue. So once I get across the street, I will be on the Tidal Basin. And this is, to be completely honest with you, my least favorite street to cross as a tour guide. I just absolutely hate making this crossing. There are about 4 total crossings you have to do to get across just the one street, Independence Avenue. And so through the magic of editing, I'm going to speed this up. Because honestly, watching me wait for up to 60 seconds to cross each one of these streets is probably not what you came here to see. So crossing number 1 is complete. And now again, through the magic of editing, we will continue. You can see the Jefferson Memorial straight up ahead. That is where we will end our walking tour today, so stay tuned for that. Now, the reason why we have an early bloom this year, and it's not surprising to me, and I don't think it's surprising to anyone who is a DC tour guide or is just generally familiar with the Washington, D.C. cherry blossoms, the reason we're having an early bloom is because we had a very warm January, a very warm February. This year, we actually had one of the warmest Februaries in local history. The February average temperature was almost 47 degrees Fahrenheit, which is much higher than the average. Now, it's typically not frigid here in the winter in Washington, D.C., so just to be clear about that, it's usually above freezing, even in January and February, but 47 degrees for February, that's more like March weather than it is like February weather. This winter, Washington, D.C. had no snow. Not a single inch, not a single flake stuck to the ground, at least here in the city. And Capitol Weather Gang actually has a really good article about how the cherry blossoms are blooming earlier and how that's actually bad for them. It actually threatens their long-term survivability. And that's because once the bloom process has started, and there are 6 stages of blossoming, we're in stage 5 right now, so this would be almost completely fully blossomed, but this is stage 5 today, March 22nd. But what happens is, if the blossoms get to this stage, and then we have a period of below freezing temperatures, it can damage the blossoms. And actually, that is exactly what happened this year. We just recently, it wasn't for long, it was only for a few hours, I think it was overnight, but it did dip below freezing, and we had some damage on the blossoms. Admittedly, it was not really severe damage, but if you're looking at this video, especially if you've watched my previous videos or you've been here before, and you're thinking, you know, these trees, they don't look quite as puffy, they don't look quite as blossomy, is that a word, blossomy, as in the past. It's possible that they're not, because of that dip below freezing that damaged some of the blossoms. So like I said, there are 5 stages. Stage 1 is called the green bud, which is several weeks prior. Stage 2 is what's called florets visible, which is about 2 weeks prior, and that's when you can first start to see the pink or the white flower starting to poke out. This is one of my favorite spots right here, by the way, the Japanese lantern, one of the single oldest artifacts in Washington, D.C. It's 372 years old. And I often challenge people to let me know if there's an older artifact in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure there is in a museum. But the challenge here is there an artifact older that's also outdoors? Because if there is, I haven't found it yet. But this 8.5-foot tall granite lantern. Originally came from Japan, and very cool hidden gem. I think a lot of people don't know about it, and really the only time people come to see it is during cherry blossom season, because this spot right here, this is the site of the first planting of the cherry blossoms, and we could talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But to wrap up about the stages of blossoming, stage 3 is what's called extension of florets. It's when the pink or white flowers start to kind of grow out of the green bud, but the flower itself is still completely closed. So at that point, it's still safe from the elements. It's stage 4 and 5 when things can get a little dicey. So stage 4 is called peduncle elongation, and that's when the flower stems start to get longer and the individual blossoms can start to be visible. You can start to see them. And then stage 5, which is what we're in right now, is called fluffy white, and that's when the flowers are opening. So they're starting to open, or they're almost entirely opened. And then, of course, stage 6, peak bloom, which is what everybody wants to know about. Everybody wants to know about peak bloom. So the first planting happened around this site in 1912. So it was a modest ceremony. We did not have the big National Cherry Blossom Festival back in 1912. There were 2 noteworthy women who attended the ceremony. There was First Lady Helen Taft, wife of President William Howard Taft, and then there was Viscountess Chinda, who was the wife of the Japanese ambassador. But we also need to talk about a third person. We need to talk about Eliza Skidmore. And I want to talk about her because I recorded recently episode 40 of the Trip Hacks DC podcast, and I interviewed the authors of the book, 111 Places in Women's History in Washington, D.C. that you must not miss. And I learned when I read this book that Eliza Skidmore gets far less credit for bringing the cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C. than she deserves. So who is Skidmore? The story goes back to the years following the Civil War. Skidmore did something rare for women of her time. She attended college, she got a job as a writer, and she traveled the world with her brother, who was a diplomat. And when she went to Japan, she fell in love with these cherry trees. I mean, just look at these. Look at these cherry trees up above and ahead. These are amazing, and I can see how someone would fall in love with them. But she tried to convince anyone who would listen to her that we should bring these to Washington, D.C., and no one took her seriously. No one. And she finally got a lucky break when she wrote a letter to First Lady Helen Taft explaining that in Japan they have these amazing trees and that wouldn't it be great to bring them to Washington, D.C., and she got the attention of the First Lady. And from there, Helen Taft kind of took over. She used her political connections to bring the blossoms from Japan to D.C. And in most tellings of the story of the cherry blossoms, Helen Taft is included in the story. And a lot of times, Eliza Skidmore is not mentioned at all. Or if she is, it's just as a sort of a footnote in the story. So here on the Tidal Basin, we have these amazing cherry trees, thanks to this woman, and yet she has no statue, no plaque, no recognition really of any kind, nothing, and that's kind of a shame. Now, this is the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, of course, the newest of the memorials on my tour. It's now almost 12 years old. It opened in 2011. Martin Luther King, of course, the great civil rights leader, killed on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And that's coming up in a few days. And the date of his assassination is around roughly the date of the average peak bloom. So in one way, the cherry trees serve as a reminder that life, just like the blossoms, is fleeting. It can often end too soon. But in another way, the beauty of the blossoms adds a sense of hope. And you can reflect on Martin Luther King and his life and his accomplishments. Even though he only lived to 39 years old, the things he accomplished were quite amazing. So when this memorial opened, they actually added an additional 182 cherry trees to the Tidal Basin. And interestingly, this came up as a trivia question on one of my tours recently. The address of the monument is actually 1964 Independence Avenue Southwest, and 1964 was chosen specifically because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So this is definitely on the Trip XDC tour of the monuments, if you've ever toured with me. I probably also told you it's one of my favorite statues on the tour of all the statues, because the statue of Martin Luther King is the only one where the background is the sky. And so you can rewind and you can go back and look at the statue. And today's sky with these clouds is particularly interesting visually. And so you can definitely get some pretty amazing photos and some pretty amazing videos and other things. Now, coming up here, this is the Tidal Basin welcome area. This is the area where you will find a lot of official National Cherry Blossom Festival activities. There are activities with park rangers. There are junior ranger programs for kids. Of course, it wouldn't be a festival event without a merch station. Right here on the right, you can get your merch. You can buy this year's Cherry Blossom Festival gifts. And there's a few food trucks if you get hungry. And while I am generally not a big fan of food trucks now in 2023, these smell so good. It has been really hard giving my tours this week and walking past these trucks and the smells, and I just want to stop and I want to get some food. Now, you probably just noticed a big group of kids on an 8th grade field trip just walked right past, and I think I see another one straight up ahead. So here comes another bunch of them. And these groups are back. People have been sending me messages and leaving comments lately asking, are the 8th grade field trips back? And the answer to this is absolutely yes. They are back. They are back in full force, and they are typically heaviest around this time of year in the spring, but they're kind of coming year-round now. So if you're trying to completely avoid them, I hate to be the messenger of bad news, but it's probably not going to happen unless you come on like the week of Christmas or the week of the 4th of July or something like that. You're probably going to encounter some 8th grade field trips. But I am working on a video with tips for how to navigate around these groups. Here's another one right here up on the left. I am working on a video about how to navigate around these groups. So if you're not subscribed to Trip Hacks DC, and my hunch is you're not, because I have analytics from YouTube that shows that over 80% of people who watch these videos are not subscribed. So I will edit on a little subscribe icon right now, and you can go down under the video, press subscribe, and then you will be able to watch all these videos as they come out, including that upcoming video about 8th grade field trip season. Now, this is the main stage. This is where they have performances from a big variety of different artists. I've seen different kinds of music. I've seen dance. I've seen music from all kinds of different countries. I actually am not entirely sure what this performance is here. I did look up the schedule beforehand, before I started, and I believe this is a high school theater group, but I'm not entirely sure. So if that was you, if you're watching and that was you on the stage, leave a comment, let me know who you guys are and what you were performing there, because I am curious. So we're gonna go through the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial next. This is another one that is included on the Trip Hacks DC Tour of the Monuments. It is one of my favorites, and I've been asking everyone for years about their favorite monuments, and this one's becoming more popular. This guy right here on the left, this monk, this is what we call a fake monk. If you watch my video about scams in Washington, D.C., unfortunately, this one is still a scam you have to watch out for. So the way that it works is these guys, if you saw what that guy did, he tried to put this cheap bracelet or something. He just put it right in front of me, and I expected me to go out and grab it. And then as soon as I took it, he was gonna pull out a book and tell me about his temple and how I should make a donation to it and all this stuff. I'm perfectly fine with people giving their money to whatever charities they want, but it's gotta be a real charity. And don't just give money to guys on the street, especially ones that are just trying to shove cheap jewelry into your hands. So I've been asking people lately about their favorite monuments and memorials, and I feel like when I first started giving tours, everyone's favorite monument was the Lincoln Memorial, which makes total sense. It's amazing. It's the GOAT, the greatest of all time, right? But lately, the last year or so, a lot of people have been telling me that this one, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, is their favorite. And I think that's awesome. I think that's amazing. Because this is a completely different style of monument. So contrast this to Lincoln and Jefferson. Lincoln and Jefferson, they both are European-style temples. The Lincoln Memorial is, the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, and the Jefferson Memorial is the Pantheon in Rome. And then you climb these giant staircases and you walk inside, and there's a big statue of the guy inside, big statue of the leader. This one, very different. No temple. It's a big open space. It's called a linear memorial, meaning you go through from the side we started on to the end where we're going to go and exit, and you learn the story of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency along the way, kind of in chronological order. So right up ahead, you can see the breadline. You can see the farm family who has lost their farm during the Great Depression era. So this is the part of the memorial where we learn about the Great Depression. And now you move into this part of the memorial, which is where we learn about the New Deal. And then in the area upcoming with the statue of Franklin Roosevelt, that's where you learn about World War II. And so it's a very, very interesting, fascinating, and in my opinion, very well done memorial. With one asterisk, which is the water. So if you've been here before, you might have noticed, where's the water? There's no water. The waterfalls, the water features, they're all turned off. And it's a bummer because water is a big part of a lot of memorials. Water is a big part of this memorial. Water was an important aspect of Franklin Roosevelt's life. He spent a lot of his time at Warm Springs in Georgia. That's actually where he was when he died in 1945. Franklin Roosevelt had a swimming pool installed in the White House. And if you're ever lucky enough to go on a West Wing tour of the White House, which I have been lucky enough to do, they will take you into the press briefing room. And that room was Franklin Roosevelt's swimming pool. They drained the pool, they covered it up, and they turned it into what is now the press briefing room. Now, I'm 100% sure, if you ever watch the news, that you have seen this room, because this is where the president and the press secretary will go to speak to the media, and it's where the reporters will raise their hand and ask questions, and sometimes it can get tense and combative, but I'm sure you've seen the room. But water is turned off in the winter at almost all of the memorials in Washington, D.C. So while I love winter here, because it's much less crowded and much more chill vibes, and if you like cooler weather, you definitely get that, my one complaint is that when you come to see the monuments memorials, you don't get to see the water. So I think that's kind of a bummer, but that's just kind of how it is. So we're going to exit now the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, and there are actually three kind of hidden gems in the Tidal Basin that I mentioned in my video about tips for visiting the Tidal Basin, and we already saw one. We saw the Japanese lantern. We're about to see another. This hallway is a really great example of the different varieties of cherry trees in Washington, D.C. So you can see some white, you can see some light pink, you can see some dark pink. Most of the cherry trees around the Tidal Basin are the Yoshino variety, and they're white. But there are also pink blossoms, and even though a lot of people think most blossoms are pink, in fact, in Washington, D.C., most blossoms around here are white. So this is the second sort of hidden gem that I mentioned. This is the Japanese pagoda, and it was a gift from the mayor of Yokohama, Japan in 1957. It was sent to symbolize the spirit of friendship between the United States and Japan, and it's a meaningful symbol of friendship after World War II. And I say after because if you study World War II, you know Japan was the enemy of the United States. In fact, it was Japan who bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii that brought the U.S. into the war. So these cherry trees have been here since 1912, and you might wonder, well, what about during the war years? Having a symbol of Japan in the middle of the capital of the United States was probably not too highly thought of, right? And it's true, a lot of people were conflicted about the cherry trees because on the one hand, they are beautiful, and on the other hand, they are a symbol of, at the time, our enemy. And so some people wanted to rip them out, to tear them down. There was a small amount of vandalism that actually happened. But fortunately, they stayed up. Most were not vandalized. And now, of course, we're thrilled that they survived. Now, this is the Tidal Basin. These people here in the boat, they've got the right idea. Now, if you do want to do a paddle boat, these little boats that you pedal, with bicycle pedals, make a reservation in advance because these are super popular around this time of year. Obviously, you get to take your paddle boat on the Tidal Basin and see the blossoms from the water. So make a reservation in advance so that you don't show up and then realize you're not going to get to do it. The Tidal Basin is actually in pretty bad shape. And you can't really tell right now because it's low tide. And I'm lucky that on the day I'm recording this, it's low tide. Because when you walk around the Tidal Basin, you will see a lot of spots that are just in bad shape. You'll run into mud, cracked and uneven sidewalks. Just like right up here, look at this random pool of water right here. That's not supposed to be there. That's not a good thing. And you'll also notice dangerously low hanging tree branches. And then, of course, high tide. So towards the end of the walk, in about, 8 to 10 minutes, we will see Stumpy. And Stumpy is a beloved cherry tree. Tour guides in particular love Stumpy. But when we see it, or if you already know what he looks like, you will know Stumpy is also one of the clearest examples of just kind of how bad things have gotten here at the Tidal Basin. So here's an example of those low-hanging branches. These trees are not in great health. I'm not a plant expert, not a tree expert, but I do happen to know that these are very popular trees for framing up, just like this, framing up for a photographer. The Jefferson Memorial in the background, the cherry blossoms in there. So good photo spot right over here. But you'll see when we get over to Stumpy just how bad things have gotten. Now, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has called the Tidal Basin one of America's most endangered places. And it's really just a simple math problem, really. The Tidal Basin seawall is sinking, and because of climate change, sea level is rising. And I'm actually going to edit on a photo that I took last year on one of my tours from the spot that we just walked along. And you can see during high tide just how high the water gets. It's a big problem. So the seawall's sinking, and because of climate change, the sea level is rising. And the damage is already happening. If you come here during a high tide, you will witness the damage that is happening. And so definitely not good, right? But this is called the Inlet Bridge. This bridge here connects the Jefferson Memorial to the FDR Memorial. And what some people don't know is that the Jefferson Memorial is actually on an island. And that island is called East Potomac Park. On a map, if you're not zoomed in closely enough, it looks like a peninsula because it's kind of jutting out into the Potomac River. But East Potomac Park is technically an island. The Tidal Basin is to its north, and then you have on both sides the Potomac River on one side and the Washington Channel on the other side. And so that park, as well as this park, was built by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they did it to dredge the Potomac River in order to fix a different flooding problem that plagued Washington, D.C. for the first 100-ish years of its history, where basically, when there was a high tide, you would have areas of the city near where the museums are now, near the White House, near the Capitol. They would be underwater. It was not a good situation. So this is one of the more crowded paths. Hopefully I'll be able to navigate my way through here. You can see some news crews. There's a news crew up on the left. I saw 2 news vans parked on the street. One of them was a DC station, and the other one was a Baltimore station. For whatever reason, the news crews, they really like this area right over here to do their, I think they're called live hits, where the reporter will go live from the Tidal Basin to show you what's going on. So pretty common at this time of year to see some TV news crews over here. Here's another, I think this might be the Baltimore station here, but in any case, definitely used to seeing that. Now these are cherry trees. Yes, they do produce a cherry. No, you probably don't want to eat that cherry. And people ask this sometimes. Actually, someone on one of my tours ate one once. Do not recommend. She said it did not taste good. And the cherries are actually little cherries that are not good tasting to most people. Here he is. This is Stumpy. And the reason why Stumpy is in such tough shape is because during a high tide, the water floods Stumpy's roots. And the reason why people love Stumpy is because he is a sign of resilience in some ways, to say, despite having all these horrible things thrown at him, right? Not only does Stumpy still live, but still blooms every year during cherry blossom season. So yeah, it's pretty amazing in many ways. So just a quick rundown of the National Cherry Blossom Festival signature events in case you're planning on checking them out this year. This weekend we have the opening ceremony and we have the Cherry Blossom Kite Festival, which is my personal favorite. I tried to do a live stream from it last year, total technological failure, did not work. But I'm going to try again this year, so make sure you're subscribed so you know exactly when that's going to happen. But the Kite Festival is when they do both professional and amateur kite flying. They have professional kite flyers, and yes, that's a thing, bring their kites and do amazing demonstrations, things with kites I didn't even know was possible. And then you can bring your own kite too. So hopefully you already bought it, or you're going to buy the exact same one on Amazon that everybody else is going to buy that has same-day delivery. But bring your kite down to the Washington Monument this weekend and fly around. It's a lot of fun. The parade is going to happen this year. That's actually going to be the final weekend of the festival. The parade is your standard big city celebratory parade. There are giant, colorful helium balloons. There are floats, marching bands from all around the country, celebrities on the floats and entertaining. And then Pedalpalooza, which is an interactive festival. There's music, there's fun for kids, and it's probably best known for being the event with fireworks after dark. So we're about to end up here at the Jefferson Memorial. The Jefferson Memorial is under construction. So if you've been here the last few years, you're going to say, man, hasn't this thing been under construction for a long time? Yes, there was roof construction for a long time, and then that wrapped up, and then they started this phase of construction where they're rebuilding the whole underneath of the memorial. So you can see straight up here, they're going to build a new ramp that goes down there. They're going to build new elevators that go from that area up to the main chamber. They're going to build a new exhibit for people who come and want to learn about Thomas Jefferson. It's going to be a good project, but it's definitely going to look like this for a little while longer. But I didn't come over here to show you the Jefferson Memorial. I came over here to show you one final view of the Tidal Basin in peak bloom, the panoramic shot. So there's a lot of National Cherry Blossom Festival signature events. There's the welcome area I showed you earlier. There's a lot of smaller events that are not the big signature ones that happen on weekdays. They happen at different times. So definitely go on the National Cherry Blossom Festival website, see what's happening on the days that you're here. Even if it's not one of the big signature events, a lot of the smaller ones are still a lot of fun. And this is going to be my final view of the Tidal Basin in peak bloom. This walk was a little shorter than the ones I've done in the past. If you are just absolutely digging the virtual tours, again, check out the video playlist or check out the video description for my playlist of prior years virtual walking tours, my other non-cherry blossom virtual walking tours. If you stuck around at the end of the video, I have to say thank you so much for watching this. TripXDC is a YouTube channel, a tour company, and I wouldn't do it if people didn't watch. So thanks again for checking it out. And as I say at the end of all of these, when you come, enjoy your trip.